Prince Harry has not been invited to the FIFA World Cup final. And insiders tell Naughty But Nice the reason is simple: David Beckham.
David Beckham went all the way to Australia, and Harry said that he'd got no time to see him. He doesn't want to see him. He's too busy. So there was Harry sort of getting ready to be with a football match, a very important one. And he was left very rudely for David Beckham. And I think, he is the king of football and all the rest of it.
There's a specific moment every fading public figure eventually faces. It doesn't arrive as a headline, it arrives as silence, a list that gets published, circulated, or simply understood. A list of who matters, who's invited, who belongs in the room when that room is the most important one in the world that week. And your name isn't on it, not because anyone announced your removal, not because there was a vote, just because somewhere along the way, the people compiling that list stopped including you, and nobody even noticed when it happened, because by the time it happened, it was already obvious. That's exactly where Harry finds himself with the World Cup. The tournament is in North America this summer, the United States, Mexico, Canada, the biggest sporting event on the planet, with England playing on American soil for the first time in generations.
Harry, meanwhile, is on the outside looking in. If football has to choose between Beckham and Harry, it's not even a debate, says a source. Beckham is football royalty. Harry is yesterday's news. For a prince who once topped every VIP guest list, that's a remarkable fall from grace.
For a man who genuinely loves football, who supports Aston Villa, who has spent his whole life around the kind of sporting events that double as diplomatic moments, this should have been a no-brainer. The kind of thing that gets penciled in without a second thought. For a while, speculation ran exactly that way. Harry at a group match. Harry at the final if England made it. The kind of presence that 6 years ago, nobody would have questioned for a second. Then the reporting shifted, not about tickets, not about logistics, but about a guest list, and one name on it that changes everything: David Beckham. Because what follows isn't really a story about football, it's a story about how completely a friendship can collapse, and what that collapse reveals about everything else. Here's the line that should stop you cold, because it stopped me. An insider told Rob Shooter that this isn't about room on the guest list. Then came the real gut punch. Football picked its prince years ago, and that prince is David Beckham. Read that again. Not there's limited space, not scheduling conflicts. A direct statement that football as an institution, as a culture, as a community of people who decide who gets into the rooms that matter already made its choice, and it made that choice years ago. Harry isn't being excluded from a guest list.
David Beckham was absolutely furious with him because there was a footballer who was going to play it and all that, and it was taking place in Australia. And David agreed that he would go and be with Harry and they would talk about it and decide what to do. Harry decided not to go because they were upset with Victoria Beckham because she didn't give Meghan the right clothes, you see. And she'd also said that they'd been leaked to the people, and Meghan was furious with Victoria. So there's a big muddle there. Anyway, David Beckham went all the way to Australia, and Harry said that he'd got no time to see him. He doesn't want to see him. He's too busy.
Harry is finding out he was never really on the list football keeps in its head. Beckham is. Beckham has been for a long time. And once that hierarchy is set, a duke's title doesn't override it. Now, let's go back, because the way this friendship fell apart is the part of the story nobody wants to look at directly, and it's the part that explains everything that follows. Harry, Meghan, and the Beckhams were close, genuinely close. The kind of closeness where David and Victoria showed up at the royal wedding, where the families socialized, where there was real warmth, not just the obligatory politeness between famous people who happen to move in the same circles. And then, according to multiple sources, Harry and Meghan accused the Beckhams of leaking private stories to the British press. Take a moment and really sit with the weight of that accusation, because it is not a small thing to say about someone. This isn't a minor disagreement. This is an accusation of betrayal at the most intimate level. The suggestion that someone you trusted with your private life took that trust and handed it over. And Dan Wootton, who has covered this world for a long time and isn't someone who reflexively defends the Beckhams, described that accusation as fanciful.
Anyway, David Beckham went all the way to Australia, and Harry said that he'd got no time to see him. He doesn't want to see him. He's too busy. So there was Harry sort of getting ready to be with a football match, a very important one. And he was left very rudely for David Beckham. And I think, he is the king of football and all the rest of it. So it was a very rude thing to do. And I think David is someone who remembers people who are extremely rude to them for no good reason, particularly if they've gone all that way to Australia. And he had to come all the way back without speaking to him. So I think that can stay in your memory. And therefore, when somebody wants to come for a great football match, FIFA, you just say no thanks.
Without real evidence. The kind of claim that, when you actually look for the substance behind it, simply doesn't hold up. David Beckham, according to the reporting, never forgave it. And here's the detail that sits at the real heart of this entire story. Once that accusation landed, once that line was crossed, there was no coming back. Not because David Beckham is a vindictive man by every account of his character across decades of public life. He is not. But because trust, once you accuse someone of betraying it without grounds, doesn't just reset the moment you decide you'd like it back. The accusation itself was the betrayal. Beckham had offered genuine friendship and received in return a public suggestion that he'd been selling private moments to tabloids. That's not something a person quietly absorbs and moves past. So the Beckhams moved not dramatically, not with a statement. The way these things always move in this world, quietly through proximity, through who gets invited where, through who shows up at whose events. David and Victoria grew close with William and Kate, and in a family system where, as one source put it, if you're not on one side, you're on the other.
The idea that it was David and Victoria Beckham on the phone giving me those stories, unfortunately, Angela, is fanciful. They didn't want to be in the newspapers. Harry and Meghan were being sold out by the people within the royal family, by the people with their own camp, by their friends, by their family members, because of their appalling behaviour. And the fact that they lashed out and blamed Victoria and David Beckham was embarrassing, and it backfired on them so badly because, look, the Beckhams don't do that. The Beckhams don't like the media either. They don't leak stories on their celebrity mates, okay?
It's a terrible thing to say about somebody, isn't it, really, without any real good evidence.
Well, if it's not
But
true, and it wasn't true.
Meghan feels so grand, like you just said. She looks very high, and Harry follows her, dunk, 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 behind her.
That shift wasn't neutral. It was a realignment. The Beckhams chose, and Harry, according to the reporting, knew exactly what that choice meant the moment it happened. Now, here's the part that tells you more about who actually did what to whom than almost anything else in this entire saga. David Beckham travelled to Australia specifically to see Harry. This was during the period Harry was there for Invictus Games activities. And Beckham, despite everything that had already happened, despite the accusation, despite the realignment, made the trip, made the effort, showed up. And Harry, according to multiple reports, would not see him, cited being too busy. Angela Levin, who has covered this family for decades and does not throw around strong words casually, used exactly that word, very rude, unforgivable, given the effort Beckham made and given who Beckham is. Think about the layers in that moment. A man who had already been wrongly accused of betraying your trust travels to the other side of the world to see you anyway, perhaps hoping to fix something, perhaps simply because that's the kind of gesture a genuinely decent person makes even after being hurt, and you tell him you're too busy. That is not the behavior of someone who is the victim in this story. That is the behavior of someone who had already decided the friendship wasn't worth maintaining and chose to communicate that in the coldest possible way, not through an honest conversation.
Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, it is now acknowledged, are a force for perpetual embarrassment. Those the words of Tim Dillon that we will get to imminently, but in large part he is correct, because that is why Prince Harry, a man who would have been expected before his move stateside to be one of the faces of the FIFA World Cup being held in the United States of America, has been shut out. And we're hearing it's in large part because of his personal feud with footballing legend David Beckham.
Not through a real acknowledgement that things had changed, but through an excuse so thin that everyone involved could see straight through it. Too busy for David Beckham, a man who flew to the other side of the world. And here's the comparison that the football world has quietly made, whether or not anyone has said it out loud in exactly these terms. David Beckham represents something football genuinely values: loyalty, presence, showing up, doing the work, decades of consistent contribution to the sport and to the causes around it. He is football royalty in the truest sense, not by birth, but by earning it. Every appearance, every ambassador role, every moment of genuine warmth toward the game and the people in it, accumulated over a career the public watched unfold in real time. That is currency. Real currency. And that kind of currency does not get overridden by a title that, during this same period, was becoming increasingly disconnected from any actual service. Harry has a title. Beckham has stature. In the rooms that decide who sits where at the World Cup final, stature wins. According to the source, it isn't even a debate. Now, let's talk about the bench, because this detail, more than almost anything else in the broader Sussex story, reveals a pattern of behavior that keeps producing these outcomes.
I know a lot about this book because I was actually the first to reveal that it was taking place. Now, this was back. I went back and looked at the story. Look, there it is. The 2nd of August, 2019. Oh my God. This woman is doing commercial deals behind our back. And I was soon able to reveal that actually she had her agent and she had her lawyer and she had her PR. And at the time, Angela, because Meghan Markle was still within the royal family and she had courtiers who were looking after her, they sort of nudged me towards saying, oh, but they're sure that Meghan Markle will donate the proceeds of said book to charity. Well, of course, that was balderdash. She never had any intention of doing that. It was all a money-making exercise, but it fell flat on its face.
Meghan's children's book was reportedly developed quietly behind the scenes as a commercial project. The public framing, that proceeds would go to charity, that framing was not true. The project was straightforwardly commercial, and dressing it up as charitable giving when it wasn't is exactly the kind of detail that, once you know it, recolors everything else. The book itself did not succeed. Reviewers described it as structurally thin, essentially one sentence per page. That kind of minimal text only works in children's publishing when every single word is carrying enormous emotional weight, and by most assessments, the words in the bench were not doing that work. The central theme, a father and son's bond, viewed through a mother's eyes, carried a particular irony that critics were quick to point out, given Meghan's well-documented distance from her own father. A book about the preciousness of that paternal connection, written by someone who has not spoken to her own father in years. And the central image, a bench with nobody sitting on it, became almost unintentionally a perfect visual metaphor for the entire project, something designed to represent connection that instead represented absence. It sold 3,212 copies in its first week in the UK. It did not chart in the top 50. Here's the financial context that makes that number hit differently.
Yeah, he must have liked her hugely, and he didn't want to leak anything at all and make her look ridiculous or not. You know, it's a long time now. And also you see her feeling jolly, a wonderful sense of humour and a little bit naughtiness about the breast that you can see on the BS. Very sort of charming and nice. And she was looking for friends, wasn't she? It was difficult for her because she's such a special person, and you know she had such a lot to show, and she just when she had a chance to talk to someone and have fun, she loved it. And this is one of them. And I think it's very nice that you see that here's a little naughty girl, perhaps a bit, who's charming, loving, and cares for people and has a lot of fun and can enjoy life. I mean, it's very, very funny.
Penguin Random House reportedly committed $40 million across a 4-book deal. Of those 4 books, only one has actually delivered Harry's memoir, Spare, which generated genuine commercial success, regardless of what you think of its content. The other 3, including Meghan's publishing efforts, have not materialized in any meaningful way. No follow-up books. Rumors of a wellness guide that has, by most accounts, hit a wall. Rumors of a memoir from Meghan that surface periodically and then go quiet again. And here's what's worth noticing about that pattern, because it's the same pattern running through every venture in this story. The jam, the Geneva speech, the anniversary post, the bench, each one launches with significant attention, generates a wave of coverage, much of it critical, and then quietly fails to produce the kind of follow-through that would signal genuine traction. $40 million from one of the world's largest publishers, and the only book that actually worked was the one built entirely on grievance against the family they left. The market has spoken repeatedly about what this couple's name can actually sell, and increasingly, the answer is not much, unless the product is resentment. Think about what that actually means for a second. This is not a couple without resources. This is not a couple without access, without platforms, without the kind of name recognition that most people building a brand would trade everything to have. They have all of it. The connections, the titles, the Netflix deal, the Spotify deal, the publishing contract, the speaking circuit, the global press attention that follows their every move, whether they want it or not.
And I have never read anything so ridiculous. There'd be one sentence on each page, and there'd be a drawing, and that it never made sense. The grammar was wrong, it didn't make sense at all. And this thing, the special bond between father and son through a mother's eye. Now, how are you going to look that? How do you know what a father feels when you're not actually doing anything about it except sort of blinking? I just thought it was just terrible. But I heard that she got people, was it one person bought 200 copies to help boost it up a bit. People were laughing at it.
And with all of that infrastructure in place, the commercial output has been, by any honest measure, remarkably thin. One book that worked. One, and that book worked precisely because it burned every bridge it crossed. The market did not reward the warmth. The market did not reward the wellness content, or the lifestyle positioning, or the carefully curated image of a couple living authentically on their own terms in California. The market rewarded the fire. And once you've used that fire, once you've burned what needed burning to generate that kind of commercial heat, there is nothing left to set alight. The question that nobody in their inner circle seems to be asking loudly enough is a simple one. What comes next? What is the product when the grievance is exhausted? Now Diana. Because every story about this family eventually arrives at that comparison, and this one deserves it more than most. Diana wrote no memoirs dismantling the institution from the inside. Diana did not accuse close friends of leaking stories to tabloids without evidence to back it up. Diana's connection to the public was built on something that simply cannot be manufactured, genuine, felt warmth. The kind that generates real crowds, real grief, and a legacy that, decades later, still moves people who weren't even alive when she passed. But here is the part of the Diana comparison that rarely gets examined with any real honesty. Diana's power did not come from distance. It came from proximity. She stayed. She showed up in hospitals and hospices and landmine fields and council estates. She put herself physically in spaces that were uncomfortable, that required something of her beyond a carefully worded statement or a curated social media post, and the public felt that. Not because Diana was performing sacrifice, but because the sacrifice was real and visible and consistent over time. There was no version of Diana's legacy that could have been built from Montecito. The geography mattered, the showing up mattered, the willingness to be present in spaces that offered nothing glamorous in return, that was the entire foundation. Diana's work with charities, her hospital visits, the moments where she simply sat with people and made them feel truly seen, none of that required a $40 million book deal to validate it. It required her presence, and her presence was enough. The bench tried to borrow some of that emotional register, the warmth, the intimacy, the family-centered sentiment, without the foundation underneath it that made Diana's version of that sentiment actually land. Diana's connection to people was not a strategy. It was simply who she was, expressed through the position she occupied. What the bench represented was the opposite, a strategy dressed in the language of connection, deployed by someone whose real relationships with the people closest to her told a very different story. And that gap between the image being projected and the reality underneath it is something audiences have become extraordinarily good at detecting. People do not always know why something feels hollow. They cannot always articulate the specific disconnect between the message and the messenger, but they feel it. They felt it with the bench. They felt it with the Spotify content before the deal collapsed. They feel it when the wellness brand is fronted by someone who appears, by every public indicator, to be in a state of ongoing conflict with nearly everyone who was once close to them. Wellness, as a brand category, requires a certain credibility of peace. It requires the audience to believe that the person selling calm has actually found some, and that is a hard sell when the headlines surrounding your life suggest the opposite. Now let's talk about what this World Cup exclusion actually signals beyond the football itself, because the guest list is a symptom, not the disease. What the World Cup situation reveals is something that has been building quietly across multiple areas of Harry and Meghan's public life simultaneously. The invitations are thinning, not disappearing entirely, not yet, but thinning in ways that are becoming harder to attribute to scheduling conflicts or personal choice. The Beckhams are at the events. The senior royals are at the events. The people who chose institutional loyalty over personal freedom are, it turns out, still embedded in the institutions that control access to the rooms that matter. And Harry and Meghan, who made a very public bet that personal freedom would generate its own parallel set of rooms, are discovering that those rooms are smaller than anticipated and getting smaller still. This is not purely about the royal family. That framing is too convenient and too narrow. This is about what happens when someone exits a powerful institution and discovers that the institution's power was not something they carried with them when they left. It was something that lived in the walls they walked away from. The access, the invitations, the guest lists, the diplomatic weight that makes a presence at a sporting event meaningful rather than just logistical, all of that was attached to the role, not the person. And the role was handed back. Harry and Meghan were told, and perhaps told themselves, that their individual profiles were strong enough to sustain an independent platform, that the public affection, the global name recognition, the progressive positioning would translate into a new kind of influence that did not require the palace behind it, and for a moment, early on, that argument had some evidence behind it. The Netflix deal was real. The Spotify deal was real. The Penguin Random House deal was real. Major institutions were placing major financial bets on the idea that the Sussex brand had standalone commercial power. Those bets have not paid off the way anyone expected, and the institutions that placed them have, one by one, quietly recalibrated. Spotify ended its relationship. The Netflix content has not generated the cultural conversation that justifies the investment at scale. The publishing contract has produced one commercially successful book out of a potential 4. The pattern is consistent enough now that it is no longer possible to attribute it to bad luck or hostile press coverage. Something structural is not working, and the World Cup guest list is simply the latest and most visible expression of that structural problem. What's particularly striking is the contrast that keeps emerging between Harry's stated values and his actual record of behavior when those values are tested. The stated value is authenticity. The stated value is genuine connection, real relationships, a life built on truth rather than performance. And yet, the specific behaviors that keep surfacing in the reporting, the accusation against the Beckhams, the refusal to see Beckham in Australia, the estrangement from his own father, the distance from his brother, none of those behaviors suggest a man who has found the authentic connection he described, leaving the royal family to pursue. They suggest a man who is increasingly isolated and who keeps, in moments of friction, choosing the exit over the conversation. That pattern matters because it is cumulative. Every burned bridge makes the next one harder to cross. Every accusation without evidence makes future relationships more guarded. Every high-profile falling out adds another layer to a public narrative that is becoming very difficult to rewrite. And the people who decide guest lists, who decide ambassador roles, who decide which names go on which invitations, they are watching that narrative accumulate in real time. David Beckham did not need to make a public statement about Harry. He simply needed to keep showing up, keep being present, keep doing the work that he has been doing for decades. The contrast writes itself. And Harry? Harry will watch from wherever he watches from, possibly at home on TV, the way millions of regular people will watch the World Cup this summer, which is, in itself, a strange kind of symmetry. The man who walked away from the royal family in pursuit of an ordinary life is now, for this particular tournament, going to experience something close to an ordinary fan's access. Buy a ticket if you want one. Watch on TV if you don't. No special seat, no guest list, no Prince of Football extending an invitation because that prince made his choice years ago and it was not Harry. There is something quietly significant about that symmetry that goes beyond irony. Harry left an extraordinary life in pursuit of something he described as more meaningful, more real, more aligned with who he actually was beneath the ceremonial weight of the institution. And the life he has built, measured not by his own descriptions of it, but by its actual external markers, the deals that collapsed, the friendships that ended, the invitations that stopped arriving, looks less like the liberated, authentic existence that was promised, and more like a slow subtraction, less access, less influence, less presence in the rooms that shape things. The ordinary life arrived. It just did not arrive the way anyone imagined it would. There's a kind of justice in that, and it's worth naming honestly rather than dancing around it. David Beckham flew across the world and was told Harry was too busy. The Beckhams were accused, without evidence, of betraying a trust they had not betrayed. And when the dust settled, the people who actually run football, the ones who decide, in practical terms, who belongs in the room, made their choice, not against Harry specifically, just away from him, toward the person who had spent decades consistently showing up, doing the work, building something real through presence and patience, rather than through the strategic deployment of grievance. The World Cup is just the latest room with a list. It will not be the last. And each time a new list surfaces, each time a new event reveals whose name was included and whose was quietly left off, the same question will reassert itself. What is the long game here? What is the version of this story that ends somewhere other than further reduction? Because the trajectory, followed honestly from where it began to where it currently sits, does not point upward. It points toward a continued narrowing of access, influence, and relevance that no amount of rebranding or repositioning has so far managed to reverse. That is the real story underneath the World Cup guest list. Not football, not even the Beckhams, specifically. It is the story of what happens when the choices compound, when the exits accumulate, when the bridges burned outnumber the ones still standing, and when the institutions that once held the door open for you because of who you were, because of what you represented, because of the role you occupied, have simply, quietly moved on. If this story has you thinking, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who's been following along. See you in the next one.